248 flights. That is the number the Department of Foreign Affairs forgot to mention. 8 months of U.S. military aircraft crossing Irish skies. C-130 Hercules transport planes, surveillance aircraft, tankers capable of refueling fighter jets mid-air. And the official published statistics recorded almost none of them. The explanation, when it finally came, was that it was an administrative error, which is technically possible, which is technically the problem. Because here's what else happened during those same 8 months. The United States and Israel launched a war on Iran. The Strait of Hormuz, the waterway through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil passes, was effectively closed. Irish fuel prices surged. Irish farmers, hauliers, and contractors blockaded the M50 motorway and O'Connell Street. 600 fuel stations ran dry. The Irish army was deployed to remove protesters from the gates of the country's own oil terminals. And through all of it, the Department of Foreign Affairs was telling the public there was no reason to believe U.S. military aircraft involved in the Iran war were using Irish airspace. There were 248 of them, and nobody said a word. Before we go any further, a genuine question for you. Drop the county or city you are watching from into the comments, and let me know how much time you have right now. Are you on a quick break, or are you settling in? The geography of this audience genuinely surprises me every time. Right, back to the story, because there are 3 things buried inside this that nobody is connecting. The first is the number that should have appeared every month and did not. The second is the comparison that makes this government's position structurally impossible to defend. And the third is the mechanism, a 67-year-old agreement signed when this was a completely different world, that makes everything you are about to hear technically, legally, perfectly fine. Start with what we know. On the 18th of April 2026, the Irish Times reported that the Department of Foreign Affairs had failed to publish 248 overflights by U.S. military aircraft over Irish territory, a gap covering roughly 8 months from the previous summer through to early spring. The department attributed this to an administrative error. It republished the corrected figures after queries from the newspaper, not proactively, not at a press conference, not in a statement to the Dáil, after queries from the newspaper. Those corrected figures showed something the original published statistics had hidden. In March 2026, the month the United States and Israel launched their strikes on Iran, U.S. military overflights of Ireland increased by 56% compared to the previous month. In the same period, U.S. troop numbers transiting through Shannon Airport, that figure was published separately 6 days later, on the 24th of April, had risen by 80% since the start of the war. 80%. That is not ambient background traffic. That is a surge. The Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, was asked about it. He said the underreporting was not normal for the Department of Foreign Affairs, which he described as a very efficient, professional department. He said the government and the Irish people wanted the war to end. And when asked whether Ireland was facilitating the war's continuation by allowing the overflights to continue, he said, and this is the quote that matters, "I think it is a stretch by any yardstick to suggest that the government is facilitating the war because of overflight. I do not think that is a sustainable proposition." He may be right about that, or he may not be. But here is the version of this story that was not told alongside his statement. Spain said no. France said no. Italy said no. 3 countries that are full members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, countries with formal binding alliance obligations to the United States, restricted U.S. military use of their territory and airspace after the Iran war began. Ireland, which holds no membership of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, whose constitution commits the state to peace and the peaceful settlement of international disputes, whose official foreign policy position is military neutrality, Ireland said yes, every time. That asymmetry is not a coincidence. It is a policy, and it has been the policy for a very long time. Here is what an actual civil servant looking at this file would see. Shannon Airport has been a logistics hub for the U.S. military since shortly after the Second World War. In the decade following the 21 invasion of Afghanistan, approximately 2 million U.S. soldiers passed through the airport in County Clare. 2 million. That figure is not contested. It is documented. Shannon became, in the language of military logistics, a forward staging point, the most westerly airport in Europe, conveniently positioned, conveniently quiet, conveniently available. The legal basis for this arrangement rests on a 1959 bilateral agreement between Ireland and the United States. Under that agreement, U.S. military aircraft may overfly Irish territory without seeking prior permission, provided two conditions are met. First, that they are not carrying weapons. Second, that they are not involved in active military operations. Two conditions: no inspections. Irish authorities do not conduct physical checks on U.S. aircraft landing at or transiting through Shannon. They do not open the cargo holds. They rely on prior declarations submitted by the U.S. side. And as an Irish Times investigation into weapons flights to Israel established, a separate but directly related story, those declarations are not always accurate. 9 unauthorized flights carrying munitions through Irish airspace destined for Israel were confirmed by a Department of Transport investigation. 9 confirmed. No prosecutions followed. The 1959 agreement was written for a world without smartphones, without open-source flight trackers, without investigative journalists who can cross-reference aircraft tail numbers against military bases in real time. It has never been substantively updated. It is the foundation on which Ireland's entire military transit policy rests. And in the current context, a U.S. war on Iran, 80% more troops through Shannon, 248 unreported flights, that foundation is doing a lot of work. None of that, however, is the real issue. The real issue is what the comparison with Spain, France, and Italy actually means. Those 3 countries did not close their airspace to the United States because they oppose the U.S. military or want to destabilize the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They did it because they made a political calculation that the legal, diplomatic, and domestic costs of continuing unrestricted U.S. military access outweighed the costs of pushing back. They made that calculation while holding full alliance membership, which means formal treaty obligations to mutual defense with the United States. Ireland holds no such obligation. Ireland's only comparable commitment in this space is to its own constitution and to international law. And yet, the 3 countries with the alliance obligation said no. The country without the alliance obligation said yes. The public version of this story is that Ireland is neutral, Shannon is a civilian airport, overflights are routine, and the administrative error in the reporting was exactly that, an administrative error. That version is accurate. It is also incomplete. Here is the part that was left out. At least 1,300 U.S. military and military contracted aircraft flew within 60 kilometers of Shannon between January 2024 and March 2026. That figure comes from open-source flight tracking, not from official government statistics. Because official government statistics, as we now know, were missing 248 entries. Of those tracked aircraft, at least 45 flew to or from Israel. The Irish government said it could not find strong evidence that weapons were being transported. It also said it was difficult to intervene or investigate. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. The difficulty of investigation is built into the 1959 agreement. No inspections, no verification, no enforcement. The architecture of plausible deniability is the policy. If this kind of breakdown is what has been missing from your feed, you know what to do. Now, back to the numbers. Because there is one more figure that ties the whole picture together. And it sits not in the flight logs, but in what happened on the 11th of April 2026 at Shannon Airport itself. A man in his 40s breached the airport security perimeter and attacked a U.S. Air Force C-130 Hercules transport aircraft, one of exactly the type tracked in those missing 248 overflights, with a hatchet. He was arrested. A 91-year-old peace activist, Lelia Doolin, had separately walked 220 kilometers from the airport to the doll in protest. During the fuel price protests of the 7th to the 14th of April, two separate actions were staged at the airport. People were sleeping in their tractors outside fuel depots, and through all of it, the official position in Dublin remained unchanged. Those are not fringe reactions. They are the pressure point where the gap between official policy and lived reality becomes visible. Everything we have covered so far, the flights, the agreement, the comparison with alliance members who said no, that is the architecture. But all of that is still abstract. Here is what it actually means for a country trying to hold a political position in a world that has stopped pretending to respect it. Ireland's neutrality is not a slogan. It is a constitutional arrangement. Article 28 of the Constitution states that war shall not be declared, and the state shall not participate in any war without the assent of Dáil Éireann. Article 29 commits the state to the ideal of peace and friendly cooperation among nations, founded on international justice and morality. Those articles have never been repealed, never been amended, and, critically, never been put to the people in a referendum on neutrality. What has happened instead is that the practice has moved steadily, quietly, and without public debate away from the constitutional text. The 1959 agreement was not voted on by the Dáil. The arrangement by which U.S. troops transit Shannon is not reviewed annually by the Oireachtas, the two-house parliament collectively. The 248 flights that were not published were not raised in committee until a newspaper found them. The Social Democrats called on Ireland to join Spain and Switzerland in closing airspace to U.S. military aircraft. People Before Profit called the flights evidence of government complicity. The Taoiseach called the underreporting not normal, and the suggestion of facilitation not sustainable. Those are four different political parties looking at the same set of facts and reaching four different conclusions, which is fine. That is how democratic politics works. What is not fine is that the underlying mechanism, the 1959 agreement, the no inspection regime, the monthly publication of overflight statistics that turned out to be incomplete for 8 months, none of that was designed to produce accountability. It was designed to produce paperwork. And paperwork, as 248 missing entries can confirm, is not the same thing as transparency. Here is the part nobody is talking about. The corrected overflight statistics now show that U.S. military flights over Ireland increased by 56% in March 2026, the month the war on Iran began. The Irish government's position is that there is no evidence these flights are connected to active military operations. The government says that if they were, prior authorization would be required. No prior authorization has been sought or granted, which means the government's position is either accurate, in which case the 56% surge in March is a remarkable coincidence, or it is the result of a system that cannot tell the difference between the two, because it does not look. Both possibilities are serious. Only one of them is being discussed. There is a pattern here that runs longer than this particular moment. Since 2001, approximately 2 million U.S. soldiers have passed through Shannon Airport. Since October 2023, 9 unauthorized flights carrying munitions destined for Israel were confirmed through Irish airspace. Since the 28th of February 2026, U.S. troop numbers through Shannon have risen by 80%. And through all of it, through Iraq, through Afghanistan, through Gaza, through Iran, the Irish government's position has been consistent. Shannon is not a military base. Ireland is not a party to any conflict, and the relevant regulations are being followed. None of those statements are technically false. And that, precisely, is the problem. Ireland's neutrality, as it currently operates, is a legal position maintained by a framework that does not inspect aircraft, does not require Dáil approval for military transit arrangements, publishes statistics that can go missing for 8 months, and has produced no prosecutions across more than 2 decades of documented unauthorized flights. It is not neutrality in the sense most Irish people understand the word. Standing apart, not taking sides, being a credible voice for peace. It is neutrality as paperwork. Neutrality as declaration without verification. 3 alliance members, countries that signed a treaty obligating them to collective defense with the United States, found it politically necessary to say no to unrestricted U.S. military access during an active war. Ireland, bound by no such treaty, said nothing. The Department of Foreign Affairs said it was an administrative error. The Taoiseach said the suggestion of facilitation was not sustainable. The Minister for Foreign Affairs, Helen McEntee, said in March there was no reason to believe aircraft involved in the Iran war were overflying Ireland. 6 weeks later, the corrected figures showed a 56% increase in exactly that period. The question this leaves open is not a partisan one. It is not a question about any particular party or any particular government. It is a structural question about a state that has never held a referendum on its neutrality, that administers it through a 67-year-old bilateral agreement with no inspection regime, and that found out the extent of U.S. military activity over its own territory, not from a government review, not from a Dahl committee, but from a newspaper. What happens next will be worth watching closely. Whether opposition parties force a formal statement in the Dahl on the corrected overflight figures, whether the Department of Foreign Affairs publishes April's data on schedule, or whether, again, a journalist has to ask. Whether the 1959 agreement comes under any formal review, and whether Ireland, watching alliance members draw a line it has not drawn, decides that the word neutrality means the same thing in 2026 as it did in 1959. It probably does not, but the mechanism has not caught up yet.